Right, the other discussants, please come to the main stage. So that includes Mark Staples, Amanda Wick, Ryosuke Ushida, Gerard is online. I'm pretty sure Eric is online as well. Is that correct? If you're online, we will pin them as well. Please take a seat.
That's right.
We also have mutual trackers who has the microphone. So again, we name everyone discussants as opposed to speakers because everyone here again is subject matter experts on ask questions, discuss. If you have issues, you can raise hand. These often don't come from very seamless collaboration. It comes from arguing.
So that was that good person answering that.
I know exactly. Right. So this session is on reconsidering blockchain governance. We were actually going to start 3 days of block 9, purely because we generally have one for each working group, then one for industry. Whereas in the name of blockchain governance initiative work, it seemed a little bit perverse that we weren't actually discussing blockchain governance itself. So by doing so, we've had this day, this half day, to have these discussions. I won't introduce myself again, but I will introduce the other discussants. I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'll just intro the session itself. So again, discussing blockchain governance, how it's evolved, how it is currently, and again, how can these multiple stakeholders interact with each other, developers, policymakers, regulators, so on and so forth. So I guess we'll start with Amanda. Amanda, what are you doing?
I had a bad feeling. Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm the token American that Joey and Steve Vallis love to call in to represent the entire country, which I always appreciate and really enjoy. But any excuse to come to Australia because I absolutely want to hear. So I was a federal prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice for nearly a decade. I actually got into crypto because I was a money laundering prosecutor, and I caught a dark net money launderer and got really fascinated with the technology. And towards the end of my towards the end of my first gov stint, I went to work at FinCEN, where I was a policy advisor. And then I left to go work as the chief of legal affairs at a blockchain analytics company called Chainalysis. And after Chainalysis, I went to work in a role as the lead financial investigator for the select committee that investigated the January 6th attack on our capital, if you were following that. And then after that, I created a nonprofit that is my passion, which is the Association for Women in Cryptocurrency, which is for women and male allies who want to work to make the future of digital finance more inclusive to women. And I do consulting and advisory work on the side.
Mark Staples.
Hi, thanks, and welcome to Australia. Yeah, so my background is in computer science, software engineering, PhD in sort of mathematical approaches to reasoning about software. But then I got back into the industry, software architecture and software engineering, eventually through software architecture into looking at blockchain as a kind of software architectural component. I've got to understand the role of blockchain in designing software systems. And from there, did various got involved in the international standards, the ISO, TC207 blockchain standards, did some reports for Australian Treasury very early on projects with various organisations, including the phone. For the last couple of years, I've been the Chief Technology Officer for a new cooperative research centre, which is half industry and half government funded in the area of digital finance. And the first project that we've done last year was to do a project with the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is one of the partner members of our cooperative research centre, where we created the world's first CBDC in an advanced economy, which was a real CBDC in terms of a real life reserve bank that was minted and issued by the Reserve Bank, used in a trial for a few months, and then bought back and then burnt into the trial as well. Yeah, so I'm our research group also worked for what's called CSRO, about 61. That's like a national research institution in Australia. Our research group there has been very active in blockchain architecture, responsible technology, and now increasingly things like blockchain governance, AI governance, various issues like that.
Sure. So, good afternoon, everyone. I am Ryosuke, Chief Executive Officer of Japan Financial Services Agency. So it is an integrated financial regulator in Japan. And then my job is basically fintech and the innovation policy. And then I was in Singapore last week joining the Singapore Festival. And then I did a bit about this week's, but to kind of attract a lot of international players to Japanese market, including these players. And then at the same time, I'm also in charge of international ML security and financial stability discussion. So I am engaged in FSB and FATA and ISO. And in particular, I am co-chair of part of Virtual Asset Contact Group together with another co-chair from US Treasury. And our job is to implement travel, and then we try to implement as many as kind of existing emergency control to the centralized system. And then it may sound weird that the same person are in charge of both innovation policy and the emergency policy, but that is kind of to strike a balance between both of them. So I used to study at Georgia University, and then doing research on the DeFi governance. So I wrote a paper on the DeFi DAO together with JFSA. So that's I used to be academia, and then now I'm a regulator. So it's a kind of governance always my interest. So I'm very much part of today's discussion.
Great, thank you so much. And Eric, could you unmute yourself for a moment and then please introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. So I'm Eric Berger. I'm a research director of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, and that is the Commonwealth of Virginia, not the greater Commonwealth that Australia is part of. I'm also a professor of electrical and computer engineering and public policy at Virginia Tech. Previously, I did serve as the assistant director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the United States White House and served as the FCC of the CTO. But given the topic today, what I'm going to be talking about is my roles in the Internet Engineering Task Force, where I was very active in both producing standards, but also in the governance. Both with IETF positions, and I was on the board of the Internet Society, which is the legal home of the IETF. And in fact, now I'm still serving on the board of the Public Interest Registry, which is where you get your .orgs from. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today. And I hope I'm not totally the voice of the big guy coming into the room there.
It sounds great, truly. It echoes this entire room. It is. All right, thank you so much again, and to all the participants and discussants. Gerard will be sharing with us today, but again, everyone in this room, anyone on the virtual as well, can raise your hand, can leave your comments. Mitchell will be walking around, so please put your hand up and please have you walking. Okay, thank you. So let's start with a great question. So I'd like to understand more about the inherent risks when it comes to looking at how blockchain governance can, let's say, overhaul or reflect the current traditional governance systems. We can all see how blockchain itself towards new governance models, but then how do we actually integrate that into the traditional system? And again, I'll let anyone hand up first.
I guess, so maybe I can speak to this from the perspective of the ISO as a standard on guidelines for governance for blockchain and DLT systems. And they took very much the perspective of looking at the variety of different sorts of blockchain systems that there are, public versus private, permission versus permissionless. And each of those, the combination of those different things gives you different kind of organizational, institutional contexts, which are very required and very different governance approaches. And they were also comparing that to traditional IT governance. So there's an existing standard for IT governance. The traditional standard for IT governance is kind of very top-down. It assumes that there is a single source of authority for the governance of an IT system, and that sort of all the sort of power and authority and responsibility flows down from that sort of point. And that if you're looking at a private permissionless blockchain system, then very often you can use that sort of same approach or same thinking. On the other end of the spectrum, then is those public permissionless systems, and then there's no single source of authority. They're much more complicated ecosystem, and so you need a very different approaches to blockchain governance. They're even trying to understand who all the stakeholders are in that sort of ecosystem is hard. I remember, for example, when the DAO problem happened with the sort of Ethereum split, it sort of occurred to me then, I hadn't realized before that, in the governance of the Ethereum ecosystem, one of the key players were the decentralized exchanges, because there was a question about whether or not Ethereum Classic would be a listed asset on the exchanges. And if it hadn't been, it wouldn't have been viable as an ongoing thing. So the kind of decisions made by exchanges turned out to be very important in the sort of ecosystem of stakeholders. So that's just one sort of point example. But yeah, so I think my answer is it can be very different than traditional sort of systems. But that's not true for all systems, because blockchain is still used in private commercial contexts, and there it can be sort of quite similar to conventional elements.
I think if I would add one thing to that, I think one of the things that's frustrating as a former federal prosecutor is that sometimes we see ideas from people that I'm like, that's a wonderful idea in theory, that will be absolutely atrocious and unworkable in execution. And then the first time that somebody told me about a DAO, I was like, this is one of those things. Because if you were to do anything collectively as a group, and I'll just use investment as an example, and somebody steals your money, will you be happy if the answer is, but nobody was responsible, you're never getting it back, and nobody will ever be held accountable? Probably not, because that's not really how humanity works. And I deal with crime victims all the time who live for the moment that a person is held accountable for the thing that is done to them. We could try to change humanity and say, we all need to move to Katya and tour, we all need to move to a completely responsible, like lack of responsibility. You are literally responsible for your input. That is a shift in mental thinking for humanity that I don't think people really think about the ramifications of that. And so I think, something that like I wish more of the community would have a discussion is, what are the problems we have and what are you trying to solve? And what are you creating that's just going to cause more problems? Because for me, DAO is the concept of that. I'm like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Is it solved by decentralization? And there's some really interesting projects where the question of decentralization and the value of that is one that we should definitely have. Autonomous, and the lack of any autonomy and the lack of any responsibility or accountability. What is that solving? And is it just going to create more problems? And I think these are the discussions, and I go back to one of the many, many incredible points that Chloe made in her keynote, which is we need to be able to have like an open, honest conversation, and that includes talking about how humans really work, and not pretending that humans aren't cheap, and that we're 99% biologically the same, and that marketing data and all of the data that's been taken from us, especially in the United States where we have zero data privacy for private companies, isn't figuring out how to sheep herd, right? And so you need to acknowledge these things and then say, you're making things for people and people are running these things. And what do people do and how do people react? People do not react well to lack of control and autonomy when things go wrong. So unless you're going to make something perfect, who is going to be held responsible when it inevitably hits the fan? And that's one of the things that I think I get frustrated by in those discussions, and it's probably one of the reasons why I'm a proponent of SROs and some kind of council, and I lean towards the projects where at the end of the day, somebody's accountable and can talk about how does technology ensure accountability, right? But that's, I think, the in-between discussion that I really love to have, because the unrealistic one, and like I think some of these things just cause more problems than there were.
The policy statement about paper was on how to achieve accountability, but with anonymity. And the issue there is, well, there we have no parallel interactions, just like whatsoever. But I think the conversation then is within how do we make frameworks, how do we design systems that can actually reflect within our traditional systems. That's very difficult. Like you look at DAOs nowadays, we're now mapping business documents alongside the NFT that houses, let's say, the institution or whatnot. It's like that's not enough. Like you don't have business registries connected to this. You don't have ways of AML your ultimate beneficial owners. There's always air gaps because traditional systems aren't ready for the likes of blockchain, in my personal opinion. So then how can we start designing systems that at least schemorphisms or methods in which we can find familiarities with current systems? Question for you. Again, Eric as well, please.
And so one thing that I'd like to highlight is that from regulators' perspective, we don't care whether or not it's DAO or not. So whether it's blockchain or not, so what matters is ensuring customer protection and financial stability and financial speed. And I personally don't like the word of tech neutrality. So it's quite ambiguous. I don't know what you mean by tech neutral, but what matters is economic outcomes rather than underlying technologies that exposure. So we need to ensure the same risks and then regulatory outcomes. And it can be the same regulatory approach as existing financial system, but it could be a different approach according to the technological development. So including part of we are currently applying a similar type of approach to the decentralized financial system. And then I think it's working quite well because DeFi and then DAO this thing right now is just a market one, and then indeed is the centralized entity. So it's working to a great extent in my personal opinion. But going forward, we may see a further centralization for the ecosystem. And in that case, we may regulators may have to change their way of doing. In that case, maybe we need an input from academia and engineers because we have the knowledge about how technology can bring to ensure sustainable development of the financial system.
One of the issues we spoke about at other block meetings and even in roundtables that I've been part of myself is this issue of layering regulation as opposed to replacing regulation. Because unfortunately we have these very heavy legislations legal systems that are stacked over and over again. New innovation comes. Unfortunately, it becomes more complicated to add context to make new starting. So I guess the question is, like, is layering regulation an issue? Should we be replacing regulation? How can we start again making ways to start using blockchain governance as means to run governance models? Now with the current.
I think because I was on the Hill in the US and at FinCEN, it's really hard, and I'm just going to use AML CFT as an example just because it's in this point. It's very difficult to imagine successfully using a statute that was written in 1970 for cash to be a successful basis for the future of AML CFT for digital assets. Because it's so far, it's so, in some ways, it's just so not fit for purpose. And I'll give you an example of this. A couple of years ago when I was at Chainalysis, I was there at the time when FinCEN had proposed the notice of proposed rulemaking for, most people call it one for unhosted wallets, but there was a lot of other stuff in there. But one of the things that they were proposing was essentially the CTR currency transaction report equivalent for blockchain transactions. And we kept trying to explain to them, the CTR was created for cash because if somebody comes in with a garbage bag full of $15,000, it's untraceable, and you want them to have to file a report to explain where that came from. But you can, on all open blockchains just go on and see all of the transactions that are of a value greater than $10,000. So you want us to submit thousands, probably millions of useless reports. So you're gonna create a report repository that could be a honeypot when you could just go online and see all of these transactions. What you want makes no sense for this technology. Like like statutory neutrality there or regulatory neutrality there was asinine because it didn't make any sense for the technology it was being applied to. And so when people talk about, well, we need to layer, I'm like, you can't build a turbo train onto steam engine rail tracks. There's only so much bolting on and layering that you can do. And I think this is why, and I think, you know, Chloe touched on this is why folks like VARA and these fit for purpose regulatory agencies are light years ahead the moment they start. Because literally it's built for virtual assets. You can do layering. You can say, okay, we're going to take a light touch and we're going to change in 2 years. The United States is an aircraft carrier. It does not move. It does not turn. Half the time, you're lucky that it just flows. And so the idea that you're going to be able to shoot things down and move fast and respond to the evolution of digital assets, there are people in the United States who talk about regulatory reform in 5, 10, 15 years. If you've been in the digital asset space for 5 minutes, you know that is an insane amount of time. Digital assets are like dog years. When you're in crypto, it's like 7 years in TradFi. So the idea that you have that long to get it right is crazy. So I think it really depends on the jurisdiction. I think in some jurisdictions, you absolutely can layer, and I think those are the ones that are going to win. And they're the ones that are going to have regimes for digital assets, and they're the ones who are going to adapt and survive. I think for a lot of us in the United States who are watching what feels like a slow toilet circling, if we don't change the Bank Secrecy Act, if we don't change the statutes that are so old that they can't even be repurposed, there is no layering on top of that. There's just sitting while everything else is moving at light speed. At a certain point, just sitting is actually moving backwards.
And it's two standing ovations.
They were seated.
So yeah, Mitchell.
I'm just going to comment on that and sort of provide some insight here. Do you think that it's a problem, I guess, in you would say Western democracies that have a 3-year election cycle to actually make substantial governance changes like you were talking about? Do you think that's part of the problem as well, or is it?
Yeah, so we actually have 2 years
Yeah.
and 4 years, which is even worse. And yes, when you have roughly 400 people, I can't remember the number, who just live and breathe keeping their jobs, that's a problem for governance. And I think the bigger problem, because Chloe put on her slide here, she mentioned 2 individuals in America. I don't know if you saw, she mentioned Gary Gensler, the head of our SEC, and Senator Elizabeth Warren. And I'm going to put Gensler aside for a second, but if you look at one senator, and there are people who speculate, I mean, for a lot of us, we've watched her say that she wanted the democratization of finance. But when the technology came that could actually lead to the democratization of finance, she turned around and tried to kill it. And I asked a friend of mine, because I couldn't wrap my head around that, and he used to work on the Hill, and he used to work for Dems. And I was like, I need you to explain this to me, because that seems irrational that you'd spend your entire career fighting for something, and in the moment that it appeared technologically, that you would try to kill it. And he said something that kind of broke my heart. He said, if your relevance from a power base comes from your ability to ask banks to jump and have them say how high, and you're irrelevant in crypto, then you shut down an industry in which you lose your power and you're irrelevant. And people don't understand that the terrifying thing in the United States is they can do that. A single person has the power to shut down an industry for personal gain. And that's a thing that I think a lot of people don't understand if they're from societies that are more collectively minded, where there are safeguards to prevent the collective from being destroyed by an individual. And we don't have that, because in order to have capitalism, you have to value the individual over the collective all the time. all the time, and digital assets requires a conversation about, but then you have a lot of problems, because if you don't value the collective, then you don't necessarily do what's right, you do what's best for you. And I don't think it's a coincidence that if you look at most of the jurisdictions that Chloe mentioned that are moving forward and are doing this well, Singapore, UAE, they are jurisdictions that value the collective largely. They're certainly further on the collective side of the spectrum than the individualistic. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think when people talk about globalization, and like, you have to play out what happens when disintermediated finance is like a bomb that gets dropped in the middle. And what happens when societies that value the collective, all of a sudden that is a massive economic competitive edge. So yes, to answer your question, I think you're 100% right, and it sadly has a huge part to do with it.
Eric, Eric, I can see you chuckle a few times throughout Amanda's unloaded monologue, so you're doing great. Thank you. Eric, you're on progressive democracies and oversee the implementation of blockchain governance.
Yeah, no, I mean, part of it was, yeah, it's that bad, it's actually worse, but I won't get into it. I think Amanda gave a really good explanation of what's going on in the US. And we have this phrase, and like-minded countries, and unfortunately, there are a lot of like-minded countries that have similar countrywide governance models. We do have, existence proofs of other ways of doing things. We have countries and governments that basically dictate this is how it's going to be. And I'm not just talking about countries like China, but, we have countries in Central America that basically said, we just decide we're going to use Bitcoin, or we're just going to use dollar, or we're going to use USDT. My familiarity is most in the internet world, and Amanda stole a phrase that I was going to use. Actually, or maybe I'll steal hers. In the internet ecosystem, we actually have fit for purpose governance. You hear multi-stakeholder said a lot, but it actually gets implemented in various ways. And take a look at 3 different organizations. The IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which was chartered by the UN. ICANN, the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, which even all the Web3 domain name people still come to ICANN. There was a whole session at ICANN in Hamburg 3-4 weeks ago on DLT-based domain name resolution. And then the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, where the technology of the internet's developed. And I would say the IETF is kind of permissionless. Everyone's individual. So this is kind of the ideal of blockchain. However, remember, in the ideal of blockchain, you need to come to agreement. So, we say, oh, we'll set up a blockchain and we'll have tokens and we'll have smart contracts. You need to agree to all that. And so, how do you get to that point? And in the IETF, basically run as individuals, to the point where I've seen people from the same company, so not even same country, but the same company, arguing with each other in open forum of, their way of doing it is right. And sometimes you would just wish, go come up with a corporate strategy and come back. So very much individualistic, whether you are from a large manufacturer, large service provider, government, military, peer organization, it's all individuals. That's a theory. There is a little bit of practice reality comes in. Who has the time and money to fly all over the world and go to meetings? More likely people from large corporations, but here we are today showing this internet thing working. You don't actually necessarily have to fly everywhere. It's better, and I'm missing being out there for the BGIN. And then you have ICANN. ICANN at the end of the day is about money. It's about the brands and their protection of the brands and people who are attacking the brands and people who innocently do things that the brands just don't like. So whereas the ITF is individualistic, there's no voting, so you can't stuff the ballot. ICANN by charter was explicitly multi-stakeholder with a bunch of constituencies. You have the manufacturers, the operators, those markets I talked about, basically the brands. You have users. It was one of the first times that users had their own constituency. So not the people selling tokens, not the people trying to displace banks, but the actual end users. And governments. Governments have an explicit role in ICANN. And as Amanda was talking about the slow pace of the American government, it's even slower in ICANN. You know, we decided we're going to sell more TLDs. It's been 14 years and we're still working on it. And then there's the IGF. You know, the IGF is basically a nice place to talk. It's a place where people can talk and they get the impression their voice can be heard. And so again, very different governance model. So you know, the search for, well, we're going to have the multi-stakeholder blockchain model. I would almost offer that's like a non-question. It's like for this, like for stable coins, how are we going to manage that? For games, do we really want games which are blockchain based and actually might have some value, but not kind of the same value as currency? Or do we really want to have the same governance structure? I don't know. I'll leave that open for all the people out there.
Quite complicated when I was navigating just the blockchain industry over the last decade. And all the organizations that come and go on, they said they were going to do this, will represent these principles, these characteristics, and most of which generally go down because they become hyper commercialized or equally underdeveloped because no one wants to participate for free. So there's this very weird balance between how do you provide support that is timely, available, and of high quality. And I'm pretty sure in my perspective, that's how we're going to make this governance system works, by having this blend of commercials, academia, regulators, policymakers.
Thank you. So I think one of the key questions that we should answer is that can we build a critical financial system on the public blockchain? So this is a lot of comments in the real asset being tokenized, and then we exist on the blockchain like Ethereum and Polygon. And then what FSA is doing together is collaboration with Singapore Mass and UKHC and then FIMA, and then banks like DBS, JP Morgan, and SBI to work on the public blockchain in the permission environment. So it's called the Project Guardians. It's kind of observer to the project, and then banks are taking the leading role to tokenize the maritime assets and then conduct cross-border transactions. And then in terms of fixed income trading, UBS tokenized the security in Switzerland, and SBI issued a stablecoin in Japan, and then we did kind of repo transaction between Switzerland, Japan, and Singapore, and it was successful last month. And then we are getting into the next phase of pilot. And then we are using Ethereum as an infrastructure. And previously, we used Polygon, but we changed it to Ethereum. And then it's not an endorsement of a specific project or specific blockchain and or specific company. They just say, oh, we want to see what are the potential as well as risks and how we can mitigate the risks using such a structure. But at this point in time, I don't think most regulators don't trust public blockchain like Ethereum and its governance. So maybe many of us don't think it's too early to kind of have a huge amount of transactions on such permissionless blockchain that regulators don't know who is validating the transaction. So that kind of thing is one of the examples that have been in our discussion among stakeholders.
Yeah, there's different, you know, originally about layers of regulation. Then Eric, I think, also brought up this interesting idea of layers of technology that, you know, you might have standards around how the internet works, around names and numbers, but that's not how the web is regulated. The web is a kind of entirely separate layer of design. It sits above and uses the internet. And so the same thing in blockchain, we wouldn't expect, you know, blockchain infrastructure regulation to be the same as token regulation. They're kind of very different levels of design abstraction. That's not what you're asking about in terms of layers of regulation, which I think was that more about sort of
More around just the idea.
purpose or technology or construct specific new law that might be created.
Like, for instance, we want to regulate tokens.
Yeah.
A token could be completely worth nothing.
Yeah.
Like, a great example, researching work on swap tokens, for instance, worth zero. But if you start regulating like the swap contract itself, as I said, like the application, but the technology, well, then we have issues where it's like, well, how about a membership token? So you want to go to a football game, baseball game, and they say, well, actually, now you put a membership token, and then NFT is now a financial asset,
Yeah.
and now you actually have to be registered with the SEC. Well, you have to be, you know, nominated for a US citizen, whatever else, right? The layer of complexity because tokens are like, you know, back to the conference for paper, 300, 400, maybe about hires 3,000 users, right? The conference of hires, you know, it's technology. So this technology we have, it seems very innocent. The application can then become continued, but can have, can for obviously like financial worth.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is also like, how is that regulation with something that is just asymmetric to current regulation?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty normal in Australia on law to kind of take just your existing law, try and apply it with, you know, additional interpretation in new situations. So that's kind of how the law kind of normally works. Until eventually maybe it just doesn't quite fit, and then people push for new law or regulation to emerge. A lot of the existing law that we have is kind of aims to be technology neutral, but often what that means is it's been designed in a way that it's designed with a whole lot of implicit assumptions about what's technically feasible or is actually available. And so when new technology comes along and sort of breaks some of those assumptions, then that's what I think causes a lot of this kind of misfit with existing law, because it's based on assumptions. Like a lot of existing regulation assumes that all financial services are operated by an entity, like the regulator has a single throat to choke. And that's not always true for decentralized instruments. So that's just one example. I think there's many ways that, and I think it's worth trying to identify what are some of these implicit assumptions that underlie existing regulation. And I think it's hard because they're implicit, so they're not being written down. But it's not worth to tease out what some of those are.
We want to go down the line that's most neutral. So by being tech neutral, so they've seen the PR mess that may come after. Say, for instance, if Bitcoin was being exploited too early on by the Australian government, and then obviously all the news, the reference to, like, say, Silk Road and other dark web markets, it's very simple. Even people who have a surface level headline, say the AFR, other kind of publishing houses, and then draw the connection. And I think obviously the implicit bias is like, well, look at the headlines. And you don't want to completely avoid that, so absolutely.
Yeah, the one thing I add, because I absolutely love that point, I think one of the things that was frustrating in the United States back when I was in the government was for a very long time, a lot of the companies in the US through their trade associations, the trade associations were largely taking the position and they were lobbying on the position, don't regulate us, don't regulate us. And for years, they contributed largely nothing of value to the conversation other than don't regulate us. And the problem with that is that over time, you lose a lot of credibility if you're pretending that the FI and DeFi is not finance. Because it's actually in the name that you're a financial service, right? And that was like a these are not the droids you're looking for kind of move. That was very frustrating to those in the government that were like, you cannot pretend that what you're doing doesn't walk like a duck, talk like a duck. It's a duck. Like, I mean, you're trying to pretend. So now, to your point, I think one of the things that are really exciting, and you see this in folks like Chloe and others who are in the space, is that they're advising regulators and the regulators want to hear it and they have the credibility and the expertise because just to use an example, if 5 years ago, DeFi entities had been going into US regulators saying, I understand what you want to accomplish in AML and CFT. And I understand what you're trying to do, but the way that you're trying to do it here doesn't technologically work. So what if we use Oracle? What if we have the technological capability to achieve what it is that you want to do? And the regulation looked like this. We'd be in a completely different place than we are now. So I do think there are a lot of us former gov people who are in industry now that carry a little bit of resentment towards the industry for being really slow to have those productive conversations with regulators that people are having now. But if we'd had them a little bit sooner, and I'm largely focusing on the United States, because I think the conversations in other jurisdictions were productive earlier, but it was very frustrating in the United States to watch people not really have productive conversations and just come in and almost do this like, what do they call it, gaslighting, where it was like, you don't really need to worry about terrorist financing in crypto, or you don't really need to worry about these things, and we could see it happening. And that was, I think, frustrating. So in terms of governance, like what I would love to see are the folks that are really doing creative suggestions to regulators that regulators largely want to hear, which is, you guys are the ones who know the technology. You know what they're trying to do. They're trying to do consumer protection. They're trying to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. They're trying to do these things. If you were them, what would you build? How would you do it? What's the technology that you would use to achieve their mission? Have that conversation, and I think this industry moves light years ahead.
So we'll pause there briefly. I'm not guys. So we got
That's right. That's right. I'll try to be brief about this. Building on what Amanda said, that it may be too late, but I don't think it's too late. The regulators, they're not, in most places, the regulators are not looking to regulate. Regulators want to have the public good satisfied. And yes, it was not helpful to say, we don't know what it is and we don't know what the harms are, just don't regulate us. I think at this point, and this is a good place for the rest of BGIN, the rest of the sessions now and future ones, how can we regulate ourselves? If we are in a very fast moving thing, this is where I disagree with Amanda. I believe it takes 8 years for anything to get through Congress and through to the states. And if we had more time, I could go through why. The point is it's not something that can be done this week at BGIN or in 4 months at the next one. Whereas we do have the opportunity. And if we come up with frameworks where we can self-regulate and we can show regulators that we're self-regulating and we're meeting these societal needs, addressing terrorism financing, addressing money laundering, addressing financing of human trafficking, then basically it takes the pressure off everyone. Because so long as there's terrorism financing, those politicians are going to be under pressure to fix it. They're going to be under pressure to do something. And if we can credibly do something, then everybody wins.
Yeah, people have said consumer protection a few times, and I don't know if it's true around the world. Western Australia, consumer protections are very different from investor protections. Consumption's very different to investment. Entirely different regulations and powers and control. So, like I was giving some advice to ASIC, which is just not advice, but education without blockchain, around the time of the first ICO, and it was a learning experience for me because when I was in the room, I realised that the investment protection in Australia meant that, for example, secondary markets for publicly traded stocks, companies' shares were only allowed to be traded on one marketplace, basically. Australian Stock Exchange, perhaps, or whatever it was the company decided were the places their shares would be traded, which is kind of horrifying. To me, that was like, well, that would be like, I was thinking of my refrigerator. Like, I have a refrigerator, I want to sell it. It's the second-hand market refrigerators. I shouldn't have to ask Samsung whether or not I'm allowed to sell my refrigerator on the Facebook marketplace. kind of offensive. And then that's what we had for like shares, right? The whole approach for investor protection is very different to consumer protection.
That was really great. I'm looking at refrigerators in marketplace, my refrigerator now, they basically did that.
So regulator is not an enemy to open source media, and what we want is social goods as Eric mentioned. And then, yeah, so we have to create a policy for those who know nothing about blockchain for the customer protection. It's okay if it's a kind of professional investor, but and then we have to do something if it's out there. For example, North Korea created a terrorist group and scoring $1 billion according to the statistics. It's just a fear. So it's a kind of imminent threat to Japanese society and global society. In that case, we have to do something regardless of that kind of, in that case, innovation, we don't care innovation because it's our priority. So that's a kind of sense of emergency that many regulators have currently. So DeFi is expanding and then the risks will be expanding as well. So I think now is a kind of critical moment whether we can work together going forward or we kind of have to do something different separately, which is not a good idea.
Yeah, if I could add one thing.
You say something very quickly.
I'm sorry?
If we're over time by a few minutes, but go for it.
Oh, sorry. I know we're gonna talk about this in other panels, but what Eric said, I couldn't agree with more. I feel like there's a lot of us who want self-regulation, we want functional SROs, but part of the problem that goes back to something you said earlier, Joe, is that the market aspects of like who's speaking the loudest in some of these markets isn't necessarily what's best for it. And I think one of the fascinating things that groups like this could do is I see companies all over the world, like there are DeFi companies that are building in AML, that are building these things in, but I'll just give you an example in the United States, they're in a trade association with a lot of other DeFi companies. And it's very difficult to represent all of them, and a portion of them are still in the old ways of, we don't need to do that. And new DeFi companies are saying, but we do need to do that. That's impossible for one trade association to speak in that voice. So you have the opportunity with globalization groups like this to say, look, let's acknowledge that there are companies that are doing this to standards, to collective levels, recognize them and put them together all over the world and make global SROs that are the best actors that are proposing standards that then all regulators can say, these are the people in the industry who legitimately want to move the ball forward. And then any company not agreeing with that is below the standards and has to deal with kind of the ramifications of that.
Absolutely. I'll just make one last comment on that piece. We'll close up with the session, we'll have a coffee break. But just to close up on that, 100%. But I think it's the fact that we just need to start saying it now because it's a voices. Because unfortunately, we have this vacuum of conversation, regulators will arbitrate, and it's about point of conversation. I think the old DeFi ways and now point DeFi corporate finance, because most DeFi protocols have some centralized controls over them. In finance space, we need to move past the fact that we're no longer in complete centralization. We have to work with the regulators, or we will be left behind, or we may be what's the word, disregarded and ridiculed. But I just want to say thank you again to all the panelists, all the discussants. Like they say thank you to Eric and all the discussants online as well. We're going to close for a quick coffee break, and then from there we're going to move to the next session as we talk about reconsidering. Now we're looking at best practices. So what can we actually talk about practically, our frameworks and designing frameworks on governance, and Bishop Travers will lead them alongside Amanda. So thank you again. Take a say 20-minute break. Let's say we could be in 20 minutes. Okay.